The numbers don't lie. We had many allegations and we investigated every single one of them. In fact, I challenged my team, did we miss anything?
An election official from the United States state of Georgia testifies that former President Donald Trump pressured him to find more votes to overturn the 2020 election result. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, the United States Senate moves toward a bipartisan gun safety bill in an effort to prevent mass shootings. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. A congressional committee has been hearing testimony on the events of January 6th on Capitol Hill. This week, election officials and workers described what they say was a pressure campaign by former President Donald Trump to change the outcome of the 2020 election. More on that later, but first, gun reform in the United States. The U.S. Senate could vote later this week on measures to keep firearms out of the hands of dangerous, unstable people. The proposed laws call for enhanced background checks and provides funds for expanded mental health resources in communities and schools. Well, for more on these issues, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Virginia is Michael Maloof. He's a former senior Pentagon strategist and analyst. Here in Washington, D.C., Joseph Williams is a former senior editor with U.S. News and World Report. From California, Spencer Critchley is a Democratic strategist and author of Patriots of Two Nations, Why Trump Was Inevitable and What Happens Next. And from Texas, Daniel McAdams is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute and co-host of the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Daniel, let me start with you, and let's start with the gun debate. You know, it seems every few months in the United States, we see another gun outrage on our television screens, horrific pictures of people being killed, people being maimed. In many instances, these are children. And then, of course, we hear about thoughts and prayers from politicians, and they talk about calls for reform, and then nothing happens until the next outrage. Well, now something is happening. It's a bipartisan effort in the United States Congress to reform gun laws, to regulate the sale of guns. It's being opposed by the main lobby, the National Rifle Association. But what do you make of these proposed laws? Will they work?
Well, they don't address the real issue in America, which is that the reason why we have a violent culture in America, at least for the most part, is that we have had a violent foreign policy for the last 20 or 30 years. The U.S. has gone overseas seeking monsters to destroy, invaded Iraq and killed 1 million people. We have a culture of violence that feeds violence. And so you can attack the symptom rather than the cause, but you're not going to address the real issue, which is the glorification of violence, first overseas and now back home in America. A new law in Washington, a new bipartisan effort to put some tinsel on this whole issue is not going to solve the problem.
That's an interesting take, Daniel, a culture of violence. How do you fix that?
Well, you fix it by stop invading countries, by stop having a $1 trillion military budget every year, which defends every other country but the United States. You stop having 1,000 military bases overseas. That's a start. You stop having the CIA finance films in the U.S. that glorify the military and violence, and we see that over and over again. The CIA is entrenched in Hollywood. So it's a deeper process. It's easy to put a Band-Aid on it and pass a bill that will really do nothing except hurt innocent people with red flag laws than to really face and take a hard look at ourselves and what's deeply wrong and sick in our society.
Spencer Critchley, what do you make of that we live in a culture of violence that ultimately that's what's responsible for the kind of mass shootings that we see in the United States so often?
Well, two thoughts. I'm sympathetic to the argument that we glorify violence too much. I mean, sex and death are essentially the two surefire themes of entertainment, and we are an entertainment-saturated culture that does rely on violence to sell movies, TV shows, video games, and the rest. However, I'm also a fan of data, and there's no real data to support that argument, while there is data to support the argument that there's a correlation between the ridiculously easy availability of guns in the United States and the violence levels. We see that state by state across the country. Unfortunately, we're a little bit starved for data because the profits-driven gun lobby and their servants in the Republican Party don't want us to have reliable data, and they do everything they can to stymie efforts to collect data.
Okay, Spencer, if we look at this latest legislation that's being proposed in Congress right now, let's say this legislation was in place before the last major shooting that we saw, which was in Uvalde in Texas. Let's say those laws were already on the books. Would they have saved lives?
I'm happy to see some progress, because the benchmark that's been established through years of just unconscionable obstructionism, in my view, is no progress whatsoever for decades. So any progress is welcome, but this is very minimal progress. And one of the key measures that might very well have stopped the Uvalde shooting, raising the minimum age to 21 for buying an assault weapon of all things, is not part of this package. And there's evidence, that here's a case where we have some data. The shooter waited till his 21st birthday, and before that was trying to get his sister to buy him a gun. He waited till his 21st birthday. I'm sorry, he waited till his 18th birthday, which was all he needed to do in Texas. If he'd had to wait for his 21st birthday, we would at least have had another 3 years of hopefully emotional and brain development. But really also these mass shootings, as awful as they are, these with the assault weapons, et cetera, represent about 1% of the gun homicides in the United States. There's just a daily and nightly toll, principally from handguns in the form of suicide as well as murders. Often occurring in poor, high crime neighborhoods, right, due to all kinds of social conditions that we're not addressing.
Daniel, what do you make of Spencer's point that there is really no data to support the claim that it's a culture of violence in the country that is responsible for these mass shootings?
Well, there is plenty of data to support the idea that where there are the strictest gun laws, like in Chicago, Detroit, and elsewhere, there is more violence than you see in states that have more liberal rules with regard to
contradicted. I'm sorry, I know this issue. This is contradicted by the data.
Yeah, blah, 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 yeah. Chicago's doing well. It's doing super great. There are no shootings there every
come
weekend.
In from neighboring states where it's easy to get a gun, such as Indiana.
Oh, okay. All right. So it's okay then.
Now, the NRA argument would say we should be flooding Chicago with guns so that the good guys with guns in those neighborhoods can defend themselves against the criminals. But oddly, they don't make that argument. Instead, they try to sell guns to frightened old white men, essentially, who are the safest people in the United States.
Well, there's a Democratic Party argument, whatever.
A young African-American male, 50% of them who die young die from homicide.
And you want to keep guns out of their hands to protect themselves from the thugs, right? What about Black Lives Matter?
Why do we not see all of the focus of the gun lobby's efforts on arming these people? Instead, they exploit them.
Look into Black Guns Matter. That's a huge movement that's going on in the inner cities to arm and train black men to use guns.
It's always Chicago, where conveniently enough, there's a collection of scary black people, and the target of the marketing is
make
always
it all about
older
race.
white people.
Okay, I want to move on.
Typical white liberal guilt.
Okay, I want to move on to our other guest, Joseph Williams.
Blame us for making it about race after you make it about race.
I didn't say anything about race, dummy.
All right.
It's always Chicago.
Let me get to Michael Malouf. Michael, according to one research group, and this group is called Gun Violence Archive, there have been 278 mass shootings in the United States already this year, and we've just gone past the halfway mark in this year. I mean, why is it that the United States experiences this level of violence? There is no other country in the world, outside, of course, of war zones, that even gets to this level.
Well, you're talking about a culture of violence, and as I see it, and I hear all these arguments, we have a culture right now, and particularly in administration, that doesn't believe in an enforcement. And the problem with that is that we have absolutely vilified the police. We are not allowing them to do their jobs, and we're not allowing the courts and have the enforcement of laws that are already on the books. Now, in terms of some of the laws that are being proposed are going to be ineffective because the federal system set up for gun scrutiny is not complete. In many states, only 31 states actually adhere to the instant criminal check. And that leaves another 19 that do not. And even among those 31, the information flow to double check background, to do the background checks is incomplete and sometimes these states don't even fulfill it. And that is something that really needs to be fixed. But what we're seeing is that it is a fact that in the strictest states with gun control laws, there is the most crime, and it's coming in from the outside. And these laws are all designed against law-abiding citizens.
This is
not
actually true. I'm sorry, it's just not true.
Excuse me, don't interrupt. I didn't interrupt.
I'm sorry, but what you're saying is not true, and I invite people
all right,
to look
do not
Spencer,
interrupt.
let Michael finish, Spencer. Go ahead, Michael.
Yes, well, and as a consequence, we're seeing the kind of violence in Chicago, in Washington. But if laws are allowed to be enforced, it is my view that these things can be done.
Okay. Spencer, you were disputing what Michael is saying there. Very quickly, what's the point?
You know, look, I recognize the complexity of this issue. I'm not sort of a knee-jerk ban guns kind of liberal, you know, as folks might assume. I've worked with police agencies. I understand, I believe, the complexities of gun violence. I've spent many years trying to reduce gang violence. And I understand, I believe, the constitutional issues in the Second Amendment. So I'm not suggesting, you know, we just need to take guns away from people. But these arguments, frankly, are the ones we hear over and over again, which are easily disproved by a Google search. For example, the argument to just enforce the laws we have, the position of the gun lobby is we should have no laws. They're absolute radical absolutists when they say that an 18-year-old should have an assault weapon, that people should be able to carry guns, buy and carry guns with no training, no screening. This is essentially the argument they've been putting forward. And the NRA these days is seen as relatively moderate rather, as extremist as they are. And they used to be in favor of sensible regulation.
Okay, I want to get to Joseph Williams. Joseph, you know, when we talk about these mass shootings, inevitably the gun that is being used is an AR-15. That's a semi-automatic weapon. That was the weapon that was used in the Uvalde shootings. This is a kind of weapon that was actually banned in the United States for quite a long period. The banning of the weapon, of these semi-automatic weapons, was because of laws passed by Congress, signed into law by former President Bill Clinton. And then that ban expired in 2004. Why are U.S. lawmakers so reluctant to bring back something that worked at that time?
Well, again, because the gun lobby is quite powerful, and because people in red states believe that they have an absolute right to carry firearms. And the AR-15, there is no purpose for it other than to kill people. It is not used extensively for hunting because you'd obliterate whatever quarry you're chasing. It's not used for self-defense because it's very difficult to get to or keep handy like a handgun is. And it's not used for cattle protection of, protecting cattle against gophers. It's a sexy firearm that the NRA and other gun organizations have kind of fetishized into this thing that gives people their quote-unquote man card. Now, it's ridiculous to assume that we'll be able to ban all of them because we can't. There are too many of them on the streets. We can keep people from buying new ones, but the ones that are already out there still represent a clear and present danger. But I also want to address one other point. People point to Chicago as the city for gun violence. That's simply not true. A lot of these guns that end up in the wrong hands do so through what's known as an iron pipeline, and that's where gun permissible states, where you can practically buy a handgun from a vending machine. People are loading up on those guns. They're going to Chicago and they're selling them illegally on the streets, which is really difficult to stop. Not to mention the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives have been chronically underfunded, dating back to Republican administrations. So enforcement has been weak. There's no universal sweeping laws that would keep these guns out of the wrong hands and would control them across different states. And you have red states that are allowing people to carry guns without any preconditions, and they're toting them to states where there are strict bans, and they can't stop them because we can't put metal detectors at the border between Indiana and Illinois.
Okay, I want to move now to the next issue we are discussing tonight, and that is the January 6th hearings. Daniel, these hearings are continuing in the U.S. Congress. In fact, earlier this week, the committee that's hearing testimony, they heard from officials from the states of Georgia and Arizona, and one of those officials said that President Trump and his associates pressured them in one instance to look for votes in an effort to reverse the outcome of the election. This is one of those officials. This is the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. Let's listen.
Because I knew that we had followed the law and we had followed the Constitution. And I think sometimes moments require you to stand up and just take the shots when you're doing your job. And that's all we did. You know, we just followed the law and we followed the Constitution. And at the end of the day, President Trump came up short. But I had to be faithful to the Constitution. And that's what I swore an oath to do.
So, Daniel, how damaging are these hearings for President Trump?
They're not very damaging at all. There's a very low viewership. About as many people are watching these hearings as people that think Biden is doing a good job. If you wanted to have a real hearing, you would allow the Republicans.
There were about 20 million people that watched that special that was broadcast in the evening at prime time a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I'm sure they enjoyed it very much. The fact of the matter is the Democrats aren't bringing anything to the table. And I'm certainly not a Republican. I couldn't care less. But when you have basically a kangaroo court where you can't even have the opposition party name its own members to the commission, then you can't go ahead and say, well, this is an objective commission that's looking for the truth. They're not going to talk about so many things about January 6th that they don't want you to see, like the 14,000 hours of surveillance, like whether or not the police opened the gates and ushered people through. Already at least one January 6th detainee has been let go because the video proved the fact that they opened the door and said, go ahead and come right in. So the fact of the matter is, Americans.
There are dozens who are behind bars. There are people who are viewing this.
Is this you again?
People who are paying
you talking? Can you hold your voice?
One moment.
Can you zip your lips for a second?
All right,
over
just
there?
one moment.
Come to you.
Daniel, just finish what you were saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, take your medication. The fact of the matter is Americans are not compelled by this. They know it's a kangaroo court. It's going to have zero effect. Americans can't afford to fill their tanks up with gasoline.
Yeah.
Inflation is going through the roof. The last thing they want is to see Pelosi Theater, telling you that there was an insurrection in America on January 6th. It's just not flying.
All right.
That's why they had to hire a Hollywood producer to produce the whole thing.
Yeah. Joseph Williams, you were saying something?
Who would argue differently.
Joseph, you were responding to that?
I was just saying there are police officers who testified who would argue differently.
Yeah.
That this was not any kind of fake show, that this was actual real, this was hand-to-hand combat, this was an insurrection in full force. We had Confederate flags in the Capitol. We had people defecating on the walls. We had evidence that there was a crowd intent on hanging the vice president if they had caught him. For people to dismiss this, for Republicans to dismiss this as political theater, I think is astounding and tells us a lot about the state of their party.
Right, Joseph, I'm going to play you some more testimony, and this is from a former Georgia election worker. Her name is Wandrea Moss, and she and her mother were accused by President Trump of stealing votes, and they said subsequently they received death threats. Let's listen to her.
It's turned my life upside down. I no longer give out my business card. I don't transfer calls. I don't want anyone knowing my name. I don't want to go anywhere with my mom because she might yell my name out over the grocery aisle or something. I don't go to the grocery store at all. I haven't been anywhere at all. I've gained about 60 pounds. I just don't do nothing anymore. I don't want to go anywhere. I second guess everything that I do.
Thing is, Joseph Williams, that it's very dramatic testimony that we're hearing there, but does this point to sedition? This point to an effort at a coup in the country?
Her testimony precisely does not, but placed in context, it absolutely is part of the larger picture. You had a president who called her out by name for doing her job, which is to certify votes in Georgia. There was nothing untoward about that election. Everyone who investigated it, including Trump's own officials, know that claims of fraud were bogus. They know that he was doing this in an attempt to retain power illegally because the Constitution clearly states that he had to relinquish it because he lost the election. For Republicans to claim that this is political theater, tell it to her. Tell it to the officers who were fighting for their lives that day. Tell it to Officer Eugene Goodman, who distracted a crowd at the cost of his own life. The crowd was ready to lynch him. These are things that can't be erased, and I think that Republicans are very defensive about it, mainly because it does point to the central fact, and that is that former President Donald Trump was using all means at his disposal, including his bully pulpit, to target people, to create a big lie that thousands and millions, I would say, have bought into and refuse to believe that it's legit.
Spencer, the panel that's conducting these hearings in Congress, it's a panel that's largely Democratic. There are two members from the Republican Party then, one of them very vocal, Liz Cheney. But is this hearing as much political as it is legal? I mean, we should note that one of the people leading the panel on the Democrat side is Adam Schiff, who's a House member, and for 3 years he led these charges that, unfounded charges, I should say, that Donald Trump colluded with the Russians to win the 2016 election.
Oh, we could go into that, but I fear we don't have enough time, so I would just dispute the word unfounded. The claim that this is partisan is just, another absurd distraction. The Republicans refused to seat people except two who were implicated in the investigation. And I will note that nearly every witness is not only a Republican, but a Trump-supporting Republican, including some of the most senior members of his administration, including the senior law enforcement officer of the land, formerly Bill Barr, including his own daughter. This is an absurd charge, and I have to assume that people who make this charge know it's not true, or else they're just not interested in the truth. Also, I think it's a sign of the moral bankruptcy of the Republican Party now, and I say that reluctantly because I believe we need a healthy Republican Party, but the moral bankruptcy to criticize an attempt to defend democracy against an all-out assault on it by an obvious criminal who's confessed on tape, like he did to Raffensperger demanding the 11,780 votes, to criticize it because of ratings is just a sign of just utter moral bankruptcy, and is an example of what Neil Postman said in his book years ago, amusing ourselves to death. If it's not entertaining, we won't pay attention. This is not the Hunger Games. It's the future of democracy. We have a moral responsibility to defend it. And if we want to get so petty as to talk about ratings, 20 million people is almost 4 times the ratings of an episode of Tucker Carlson, which Fox celebrates as accurately as one of the most popular shows on television.
Michael Malouf, what is your assessment of the hearings so far? I mean, how big an impact do you think it's going to have politically, especially, we've got elections coming up in November, the midterm elections. Those are important elections, and the impact could be felt even in 2024 during the next presidential election. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that what has been brought out in this TV show, really, that's all it was something we expected, we knew about, the details of which were very interesting and enriched what we already knew. I don't think it's going to have much impact on the 2022 or the 2024 election. It would have an impact on Donald Trump personally, but I take issue with the composition of the committee, the fact how it was structured, and the fact that they're not allowing any testimony from the Sergeant at Arms or the Speaker of the House. They're not allowing. There's nobody there to raise the question, an opposition, if you will, as to what intelligence was there that they had, because there was intelligence. There was going to be a riot. This committee hearing has not really shown a link between Donald Trump instigating and conniving, or conspiring rather, with the Proud Boys and the others who actually committed the atrocities in the Capitol.
I have to ask, in all seriousness, have you been watching these hearings?
I'm not finished.
Have you been watching the
I'm being cut off
One
again.
moment, Spencer. I'll get to you. Go ahead, Michael.
At the same time, I would contend that Nancy Pelosi had the intelligence. She knew that there would be a potential for violence, and she allowed this to go on.
Yeah.
And have the demonstrations and the intrusions into the Capitol. Now, this hearing does not get into at all.
Yeah.
What about the crimes that were committed and the burnings of the cities that occurred during the summer months? Yeah. This is something that has not been brought out in cities that are run by Democrats.
Okay.
And so that's why this whole thing is so contrived.
Spencer, very quickly, your response.
well, this is absurd, and it's disappointing to attempt to have a debate with somebody who's obviously not actually watching these hearings or has no interest in making a good faith argument. These are absurd claims. It's nonsensical to think that Nancy Pelosi is somehow
Again,
at
you
fault
make assumptions
for something
that have absolutely no
for something that the committee has
and you have absolutely no
documented
knowledge of what you're talking about.
That I've been watching the hearings and I actually follow the news. And so President Trump, they have been demonstrating step by step, I think in admirably dispassionate detail, how he has been planning that for months and then sat by and enjoyed the show. To blame that on Pelosi is just absurd.
We are running out of time. I want to get to Joseph Williams. Joseph, the committee will release a report in September. Do you expect that there'll be legal action taken against President Trump? And if there is legal action taken against him, how do you think his support base will respond to that?
Well, I mean, two things occur when that question gets asked. The first is, how on earth are you going to try a former sitting president? How is he going to get a fair trial? How are you going to seat a jury? I think that's a lot of the hesitancy with the Justice Department. The second thing that occurs to me is President Trump, I would imagine that he wouldn't hesitate to get his supporters in the streets. As a matter of fact, he said so on several occasions. However, I also should say that that does not mean that the Justice Department will consider the former president above the law. In fact, there have been many, many instances that have been displayed not only in this committee, but in different investigations. One investigation in Georgia, another couple of them in New York, have shown that the former president has committed several violations of the law, and he did so while in office with impunity almost. So I think it's going to be interesting to see the Justice Department's next move. Do they really believe that that no one is above the law, or do they subscribe to the notion that former presidents being prosecuted is a political act that the country won't stand for?
Daniel, very quickly, I've only got less than a minute left, but are you surprised by the fact that the FBI won't answer questions about how many agents were in that crowd on that particular day? In fact, there was a hearing at which Senator Ted Cruz asked those questions, and there were no answers. Does that surprise you?
Well, my colleagues on the panel wouldn't be interested at all in that, but we've seen over and over again that the FBI gets involved in a marginalized group. It does provocations, it gets them to do things they wouldn't normally do, and then it says, "Aha, we busted a terrorist group." How many of them were there? Why shouldn't we know? What's the problem? We saw the people on the ground saying, "Hey, go in, let's go in, let's go in and do it," and you never hear anything more about it. So yeah. The FBI has a pattern of doing this. Why, if we want to get to the truth, let's get to the truth, the good, bad, and the ugly. Okay, Trump's a bad guy. That's fine. I'm willing to accept that. But let's hear the other side of it. We're never going to hear that because this is a kangaroo court.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time, but thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.